Do you hear it, brother? The howl that bleeds through the stars. Listen, not with your ears, but with the hollow where faith used to live. It comes on a wind the void cannot carry. A thin, hungry sound that tastes of rust and old wars. If you do not hear it yet, quiet your world. Silence your lights. Brace your heart. For once the song begins, there is no turning away. The strike cruiser, Fenrisian Vow, hung like an oath in the black, a slate tooth against the dead light of Skelheim 9. Her hull wore battle scars like badges of bitter memory, rut-streaked ceramite, a pitted prow that had once split a void hulk, banners stitched with blood and prayer. Orbital plates rotated in the hush, coils of engine-scarred cabling singing faintly as the vessel corrected her burn. Above, the planet below was a paper cut of tarnished cold, crags and frozen vents, shallow seas of stagnant ammonia, and the dull shimmer of an old mining lattice gone mute. The distress beacon had called them, a single, strangled rune wired into the moon's orbital array and pulsing with the ghost light of something desperate. The Fenrisian Vow answered because that is what wolves do. They run toward the sound of broken things. On the bridge, Commander Eirik Stormfang stood like a statue weathered by war. Wolf Lord of the Bloodhowl Great Company, his mantle still bore the scent of cold iron and colder victories. Close-cropped hair, a face mapped with a dozen scars, and eyes the color of glacier ice that had seen too much storm. Beside him, the standard of his company hung taut and solemn, a snarling wolf head embroidered in thread so old it had turned to the same gray as bone. Eric's hand rested on the ship's rail. The Fenrisian Vow hummed beneath his boots. The great engines cycled, the reactors breathed in the measured rhythm of a living thing restrained. Yet in that rhythm there was an unevenness, a twitch, a half-beat that set the great ship's teeth on edge. "Status," he said. His voice was low. Space wolves are not given to needless words, but when they speak, things listen. Lieutenant Haldar answered from the comm console. "Beacon confirmed, Lord. Distress sig originates from the Skelheim orbital lattice. Emissions unstable, large Vox anomaly riding the pulse. No friendly traffic registered. We are in position to—" Haldar's words snagged. The ship's coitators labored and hiccuped as if breathing ash. Screens flashed a brittle blue, then stuttered to a smear of static. A whisper threaded beneath Haldar's voice, thin and almost amused. "We are already aboard," the whisper breathed, not from a speaker but from the seams between the ship's data threads. Electrical hum became syllable. The crew at the console froze, fingers hovering over illuminated runes. Eric did not flinch, not outwardly. The space wolves have 1,000 ways to measure portent, sagas, blood rites, the scent of old wolves on a wind. This thing was not one of them. It was a distortion folded into signal. A sound that had learned how to call in a soldier's name. Ulric, the Rune Priest posted near the astropathic circle, dipped his head beneath a hood of iron filigree. His hands made small, careful patterns over the shrine, and the Geller field shimmered like heat over tundra. "There is something in the signal," he murmured. "Not only a call, a song beneath the Vox. It tastes of the warp and of mourning. Be watchful, Wolf Lord. Songs can deceive." Eric's jaw tightened. Beneath Ulric's words, he felt another thing. The echo of a childhood howling, wolves running across frozen plains beneath the pale aurora of Fenris. It was a comfort that had become a caution. He should have been able to trust the bones of that comfort. The old smell of hearth and hunt. Instead, something tugged at the memory, stretching it like a string. "Keep shields at green," Eric ordered. "Prepare the boarding lance. This is a recovery and assessment. No heroics. We hold formation until we understand the hazard." Haldar complied, fingers swift and sure, but the ship's heartbeat skipped again as if the void had caught its breath. Lights along the forward bulkhead dimmed, humming down, then flaring as local power surges crawled through conduits. Consoles spat warnings in languages stitched with sigils. The Fenrisian Vow moved like a great hound sniffing the air, the pilot's hands steady at the helm, piloting through the lattice of wreck and ice. The distress call repeated then, but not plainly. The beacon, somewhere far below in the planet's failing lattice, modulated into a tone that knifed through steel. At first it sounded like a child sobbing into an empty chapel. Then, under that, an undertow, voices braided into a chorus that hummed with an intelligence. It was a tune that did not intend to be heard. It intended to be owned. Ulric closed his eyes a moment, letting the sound scrape the inside of his skull. He pictured his sons in the great company, broad-shouldered wolves with calluses on their palms, men who knew how to sing a victory into being. He pictured the space wolves march across worlds and the oath that bound them to brotherhood and bone. He felt something like grief settle under his breastplate. Not his own grief, but the leftover of a grief older than him. A technician at the far console yelped, fingers twitching as if pricked. "Lord Stormfang," she began, then stilled. Her mouth moved soundlessly as the signal threaded closer into the ship's systems. Screens flared with faces, not the faces of men but the imprints of faces, like negative prints burned into glass. For a breath the bridge was full of ghosts. Ulric raised a hand, his rune-carved staff ticking against the deck. "This is no ordinary distress. The signal is a lattice of sorrow and command. It will ask questions we cannot answer and offer bargains we must not take." His voice was not loud, but in it was the iron-weathered certainty of one who has stared into the warp and not winked. Ulric's reply was a single, certain thing. "Then we do not bargain." He took one step forward. The deck thrummed beneath him. Behind his eyes something moved, an echo of the howl that had started in the narrator's mouth moments before, like a memory catching at a spearhead. He felt the ship lean toward the beacon, as if the vow itself were curious. A creature pulled by scent. The comms hissed, and for a second the bridge filled with ordinary work. A map redrawing, engines realigning, orders clipped and precise. Then, like a thing finding voice in the throat of a dying world, the distress signal changed. It shed static like a skin, and the tone shifted into words, low and human and wrong. "Ulric," it said. Not a voice over Vox, but the signal slotted into the bone of his name. "We are hungry." The bridge lights flickered. Warning glyphs stuttered. The Gela shimmer pulsed in prayer. Men and women on the deck felt the hair lift along their necks as if a winter wind had blown through them. "Report," Ulric snapped. A dozen systems answered. But before the reply could finish, the ship convulsed. A cold rush flooded the hull as conduit and coil failed. Consoles guttered. The great ship's lights died one by one, as if a maw had passed its hand across the stars and snuffed the world's little fires. In the instant before the blackout, the distress beacon's last modulation bent into a sound no Vox should sing. A human scream, stretched thin by frequency into something that was both pleading and laughing. It threaded through the bridge like a blade, and then everything went black. "Do you hear the last thing that lives? Hold it close, breathe it in. For the howl is only beginning. The void keeps its own counsel. It dresses its lies in silence and wraps its teeth in the rust of dead machines. Listen now, not for the thunder of war, but for the small, ashamed sounds that precede it. A hinge weeping, the sigh of a servitor, the faint buzzing where a Vox has learned to whisper prayers back to the thing that listens." They came down like wolves on a scent. Ulric Stormfang led the boarding lance, 5 grey hunters in pattern grey, pelts-braided axes and last carbines slung like old promises. They were a compact pack, Joran broadhand, heavy and careful. Sina the quiet, eyes shuttered with focus. Brack, who liked to hum when danger thinned the air. Rurik, young and lithe, and Haldar, the lieutenant who kept the orders and rarely misplaced his calm. Their boarding skiff spat flame and dust as it gouged atmosphere, carving a path through the moon's grinding sky. Skelheim Nye met them with a storm-made face. Gale teeth tore at the hull plates. Dust devils like small grey beasts raced across the plains. The hab domes of the old mining lattice were cracked like old skulls, veins of polymer splitting and steam leaking like breath. The orbital array that had broadcast the plea loomed above the main pit, a construction of metal and frozen glass carved into an obscene parody. A wolf's skull, jaw open, antennae like ribs. Its maw stared at the world and chewed on the cold. The skiff tipped and spat them onto a service decking sheared from some long-forgotten maintenance rig. Their boots bit into grit that smelled of ozone and burnt oil. Ulric's cloak snapped against the wind. He could taste the static before he felt it, a metallic tang at the back of the throat. The world below them seemed to breathe in tiny, static, shocked breaths. "Keep tight," he said. His voice was short and clean as a blade. "We move as one. No stray lights. No needless talk." They tied to the lattice and climbed, each step a small argument with gravity. The array's bones groaned under their weight, metal groaning like bone under strain. And the wind carried far-off percussion, the slow, regular banging of a lost pump, the high violin whine of failing hydraulics. Somewhere below, a pipe burst and whispered steam like the ghost of a voice. Inside the maintenance corridor, the light was a rumor. Filament strips winked and died in the draft until the only light was the pale halo of the Grey Hunters' helmets and the soft, ritual glow of Ulric's wolf banner icon screwed to his pauldron. The corridor walls were pitted with impact scars and tagged with the pale scrawl of miners' markings that had long since lost their meaning. Between panels, servitor mounts had once been bolted, mechanical men in tethers and supports. Now the mounts themselves seemed to have eaten their charges. At first glance, the servitors had become part of the walls. Their hands and skulls fused into conduits and conduit casings, wires grown like roots through corroded flesh and ceramite. They stood like altars of service, one shoulder a coiled hose, another a lens smashed into a permanent stare. Their lenses flickered with residual charge, and if a man listened close enough, he could hear them. A thread of sound, thin as wool, leaking from their throat grills. The same sound repeated, not as a call but as a prayer. "We found more," Sina breathed. She moved with the care of a woman clearing a shrine. Her gloved fingers brushed a fused servitor's cheek plate, and the metal at her touch shuddered like something remembering touch. The whispering filled the corridor. It was low and constant, not a loop of recorded vox, but something that had folded the distress call into itself and was running the phrase like a mantra. "Help, help, help." It intoned in a dozen cracked timbres, sometimes stretched so thin the words were only wind, sometimes thick and alive. Static crawled across the Grey Hunters' comm channels like ants. Ulric's hand touched a servitor's embedded wrist. There, under the grime, the factory stamp told a tale. Mark IV servitor, purpose, excavation and lattice maintenance. Someone, or something, had fed them into the lattice as ballast and left them there as living metal. Rurik's boot found a spill of dark matter pooled in a corner. Brack knelt, fingers closed over a fistful of what might once have been hair. It stuck to his gloves like thread. He gagged and turned away. They moved deeper into the heart of the array where the signal's pulse throbbed like a dolorous drum. Antenna towers bowed to the wind, their rims clogged with ice and miner's rime. Screens where they remained danced with ghost imprints, lines of telemetry, and then a spidery overlay, audio logs, now corrupted, now looping. Once in a while, a single frame would clear, showing a miner's face or a checklist. Then static would overrun it. Vox pockets would swell, sigh, and then collapse. Ulric's presence felt through their comms like a benediction. He murmured under his breath, tinkling rune mutter like gears finding match. "The song eats at the edges," he said into the ether, not wanting the wind to take his words. "It is not content with an opening. It wants a throat." "Be still," Ulric nodded. They came for a beacon. They would either recover it, or they would mark its history with their blood. Their boots stopped at a central vault where the distress lattice was mounted, a grotesque altar of antennae and plated bronze. The beacon itself was no larger than a man's chest, yet it pulsed with the light of a broken star. It bled a thin spectrum of frequency into the air. The air around it smelled of old prayer and repurposed metal. Haldar knelt and ran a sensor probe over the casing. Readouts flashed, interference, anomalous harmonic layering, a feedback loop. The probe beeped, then went dead. Haldar's fingers hovered, 100 small adjustments unmade. There was a sound in the walls then, a slow, patient creak, like something moving within metal. The servitors in the corridor shifted their fused limbs as if awakening from sleep. They did not turn their heads. They were part of the lattice now. But the whispering changed pitch and clarity, and for a moment it was as if the entire array breathed in unison. Sina heard it first, that tiny human cadence grown from rust. She paled and stepped back, hand clapping over her mouth. "By the All-Father," she whispered. Ulric's eyes narrowed. He lifted his last carbine and swept the vault light over the servitors. They stood like a forest of dead worshippers, their vocalizers ticking and clacking as if trying to form speech. One flickered in the periphery, lens sputtering, and its throat grill twitched. What they did not expect was the intimacy of it. The fused servitors held their whispering like a secret. The distress call was not being broadcast for rescue. It was being repeated into the inner ear of something that listened. Each repetition had a patience to it, an insistence like the patient drip of water that wears stone. Ulric stepped forward and set his palm over the beacon's casing. The device was colder than the air, cold like the inside of a tomb. The skins under his gauntlet bristled with static. He felt, as one feels a hand through a scarf, the faint vibration of a voice that was not his. "Status?" he said into comms. It felt absurdly mundane, a ledgering of facts in the face of strange worship. Haldar answered, voice clipped. "Beacon unit shows host layer permutations. Coils fused with organic filament. Signal replicates local vocal patterns. It's copying." The corridor held its breath. The whispering tapered. The servitor's vox racks hummed like throat muscles preparing a word. And then, from a fused throat not a meter from Ulric's helm, a voice thin as a rasp and curved with the honey of circuitry said clearly, plainly, as if reading a name from a ledger, "Ulric Stormfang." For a scattered beat, the world stopped making ordinary noises. The wind hiccuped. A wrenched ring echoed from some distant maintenance shaft. Haldar's hand trembled on the console. Brack's hum died where it began. Ulric did not speak. The name had not passed his lips. It had not been sent over any sigil or vox node he controlled. The servitor's eyes, embedded in the wall like fossilized cabling, glowed with a patient light. The whispering swelled then thicker, and the lattice's heart pulsed. "Help, help, help, Ulric." When a machine learns your name before you give it, the world tilts on an older hinge. Hold your breath, brother. We are not alone here, and the beacon has begun to learn whom it is asking for. The long silence broke like a bone. When machines turn their prayers inward, metal remembers how to rend. They moved through the belly of the lattice where the array's guts were exposed. A cathedral of conduit and cog. Steam hissing like breath through a dozen torn lungs. The air tasted of ozone and old oil. Each footstep echoed like a metronome counting down. Ulric led, wolf banner at his shoulder, his grey hunters a living wedge behind him. The servitor's whispers stitched the corridor into a thin, insane roulade, repeating pleas, cries, the same syllables braided through static. They found the tech priests in a chamber that had once been a maintenance hub. Now it was a shrine. Wires curled like sleeping serpents, screens blinked frames of ritualized schematics. At the center, on a dais of grimed plating, 2 mechanicum priests hung from harnesses. Their robes were shredded. Their flesh had been braided into cable. Omniscient sigils had been carved and resoldered with a barbarous hand. Their augmetic eyes shone with colder lights than the orbital stars. They chanted. It was not the orderly litany of the Blessed Forge. The syllables were modified, defiled. Each word was an instruction to darkness. Their vocalizers clacked and hissed, and the recorded prayers bent into mechanical praise for something that was not the machine god. Praise metal, praise rust, praise the hunger of cause, they intoned in unison, voices layered with the metallic rasp of servitor vocal cords. From their chests, tubes fed out like the roots of a diseased tree into the dais, and the dais itself had become a mouth. Ulric's hand tightened on his axe. His bone-grey eyes cut the chamber in a single sweep. Hold down, take down on my mark. Keep formation. Do not let them break into the lattice proper. Haldar's reply was a small sound. Acknowledged. Brack's hum stopped. His lips went thin. Rurik's fingers found the grate of his last carbine. Sina's eyes narrowed to slits. The pack braced like hounds before a charge. Ulric raised his axe. The banner at his shoulder snapped. Now. They struck. The first exchange was a thunderclap. Bolter fire cracked like snapped bone. Last fire scalped steam from piping. Fragments of ceramite bit out of a priest's shoulder. The corrupted mechanicum answered not with retreat, but with a greater ritual. Their hands, fused into servo arms, slammed into panels, and the chamber convulsed as if hit by a fist. From the dais, tendrils of braided wire and filament uncoiled like angry fingers. Fire met mechanism. Short sentences, knife-sharp bursts. Brack's last bolt stitched a servo arm to slag. Sina knifed through a harness with the flat of her blade, and the priest's throat grill choked on its own hymn. Sparks flew like malevolent fireflies. The Grey Hunters moved as one breath, a practiced slaughter. Each strike measured and brutal, then Joran screamed. He was always closest to the lead. A massive man who treated threats with the blunt instrument of his hands. A coil of blackened cable, slick with oil and something darker, had lashed from beneath the dais. The thing moved with a speed no servitor should possess, a whip of metal and sinew. It curled about Joran's leg and in one instant wrapped his torso like a harness. He tried to cut free, axe biting false hollows, but the cable only tightened as if reading his attempts and tightening in response. "Tendril!" Rurik shouted, but the warning came too late. The conduit yanked him. It pulled him toward a yawning vat, a cogitator pit, its surface a pool of sludged coolant and whispering data threads. The pit's rim was lined with teeth of broken glass and ceramic. Joran thrashed, boots skidding across wet metal. The Grey Hunters lunged, hands grappling at the cable, but it was like trying to wrestle wiring out of the hull. The thing had purchase and will. For an instant, Joran's face was a memory. A grin, a laugh, a brother waving in some sunlit mess hall. Then the tendril tightened, and the pit claimed him. He vanished with a noise that was equal parts human howl and the hungry stutter of corrupted drives. Flesh-sewn cables slid over his shoulder like curtain, pulling him deeper. Brack grabbed for his arm and felt it slide through the coil as if through oil. He could not hold him. The last thing Joran did was meet Eirik's eyes, and in that look was a raw, bright fury that made the Grey Hunter's helmet seem suddenly too thin. He did not come back. The chamber answered with the chorus of its corrupted priests. Their praise rose now faster, jubilant, for the hunger, for the weld, for the coil. The cables pulsed as if with heartbeat. The corruption fed on the fight, drinking the heat and fury that the Grey Hunters brought. Each shout, each blast, each thud of boot on grimed steel made it stronger, made it slicker and more confident. Anger was fuel. Eirik's voice cut through the chaos, low and hard. He moved like a blade. His axe fell in an arc that sheared a servo arm from a priest's chest, sparks kissing his gauntlet. He smelled blood, not only Joran's but his own, a different tang raising behind his nose. He tasted the old Fenrisian hunger, for justice, for retribution, for the ritual satisfaction of guarding land that stretched across worlds. The corruption tasted that hunger and smiled without a mouth. Sina's blade flashed. She drove her dagger between conduits. The priest's back split and a tangle of servitor circuits poured out like guts. Brack howled, slamming his shoulder into a console and pulverizing it into hot slag. Rurik fired until his lasgun bar glowed and then switched to a knife. The battle whirled in furious focus, close, intimate, brutal. The Grey Hunters burned a path of blue-white desperation through the corrupted shrine. Amid it all, the beacon on the dais pulsed with patient light. Its tone rose and shifted, tasting the room like a mouth parsing the sound of men. It fed on the cadence of voices, on the pattern of names. Eric's commands were metal to it, salt and blood. When the blast threw sparks across the dais, the beacon took the electrical noise and translated it into syllables. Eric staggered back, breath hot, as a gout of coolant sprayed his face. He blinked away the sting. He cupped his hand to his throat and pulled a small Vox recorder from a pocket beneath his mail. He thumbed it to record with hands that were steady with intent. "If we fall," he said into the hiss and the rush, his voice a slow, deliberate thing meant for ears that might never hear. "Make our deaths a warning. Tell them Fenris remembers. Tell the sons of Rust that the blood howl stood for its kin. If we fall here, let it be a long winter for our enemies." He sealed the message and placed the recorder in a pocket, pressing his palm to the sigil of his company, as if to thank the dead for watching. Around him the battle did not ease. Sparks licked at the dais. Servitor limbs twitched, wires flaring like wounded veins. The corrupted priests were not only priests, they were anchors, and where anchors are cast, the sea is bound. Brack's cry shook Eiric's bones. He turned and saw the tendrils undulating, the cable reaching, tasting the air. The chamber's speakers, fused into the walls in crude arrays, caught the tone of Eiric's recorded oath, his voice imprinted into the room's electrical memory, and the beacon took it up. For a beat, the noise of gunfire and the creak of a dying lattice was drowned by the beacon's modulation. Then it cleared like a throat and, with a precision that made the hair on Eiric's arms rise, repeated his words. Not a paraphrase. Not a mock. His voice, hard and true, echoed through the chamber, carried by the lattice and painted in static. "If we fall," the beacon said, in Eiric Stormfang's own cadence, "make our deaths a warning." The Grey Hunters froze mid-fight as if the words had struck bone. Joran's absence yawned in the room like a wound. The corrupted priest's singing swelled into laughter. When a man's oath is taken and turned into a weapon against him, the world has learned a new cruelty. The lattice has learned to speak like a wolf and to howl like the dead. There are minds at sea that do not belong to men. Listen to them closely, brother. The thin, age-washed voices that curl under the hull and press their faces to the glass. When they speak, do not answer too quickly. The warp remembers everything you ever loved and every oath you ever broke. Ulric Thane stood 3 decks below the bridge, wrapped in the iron-wrought hush of the rune chapel. The rune priest's robes were a patchwork of iron filigree and prayer cloth, sockets and lenses like the teeth of some holy machine. He bore the marks of company and right, scalpels of sigils embedded in bone, staves carved with 100 small runes that caught the light and spat it back like flaked snow. To the untrained eye, he might seem a strange amalgam of monk and engine, but to men of blood and bone, he was a touchstone. The ship's conscience pressed into metal and faith. He had felt the song since they dropped from the orbit's dark. At first it was a pressure, a small halo of wrongness that sat behind his teeth like a coin. Then it grew into images, gnomic, urgent. Wolves with coats of ash running across plains of black glass. Stars like open wounds bleeding slow constellations. A sky in which runes burned like frost. The visions came not as a torrent, but as a steady fall, each one a metal moat that embedded itself in the priest's thoughts. Ulric closed his eyes and let the factory of those visions work. He breathed slow, drawing in the ship's filtered air until the taste of copper settled under his tongue. Then he reached out with what he had, not a hand but a litany, a practiced net of rune words cast into the dark to feel for tremors. His mind slid along networked thoughts, the ship's hydraulics and the crew's dream sleeps, and it brushed the choir. The astropathic choir's chamber lay aft, a cylindrical room ringed with whisper boxes and braided throat grafts. It was where the ship spoke its long-distance prayers into the immensity between stars, where messages were knelt into song and flung into the Empyrean. He entered quietly. The chamber smelled of incense and coolant. A dozen choir singers sat crumpled in their harnesses, cords like tendrils affixed to clavicles, faces pale as bone. Their eyes were open but sightless. Their mouths hung in the frozen arc of scream. No breath moved in their ribs. Runes on their breastplates pulsed with a heartbeat that was not their own. Ulric moved among them, hands hovering like a surgeon. He pressed a palm to a throat plate and felt a faint froth of psychic static, like the aftertaste of an echo. Each choir member had been touched by something that arrested their voices in mid-creation. Their minds were not empty. They were full of a single trapped sound, a loop caught like a fish on a hook. He could sense it as a thread of tone, vibrating within bone. He whispered an invocation, and the stone of his voice settled over them. By the blessing of the All-Father, by the craft of Omnissiah, speak for us. No answer. Only the frozen mouths, lips hollowed into the shape of spent words. Ulric's fingers trembled as he traced a glyph across a corroded conduit, and the ghost of a choir note slid through his mind, thin, like a child's first cry, then snapped back into silence like a trap shutting. He sank into the nearest husk and placed his temples against the metal rim of a speaker. The choir's internal feed was an ocean of muted noise, scraps of prayers, a half-formed epithet, the memory of a voice calling a name in terror. It was like listening to a ruined cathedral through a rainstorm. Meaning was there, but scrambled and broken. Ulric's hands worked without haste. He traced rune circuits, coaxing micro-frequencies into harmonic alignment, singing under his breath the old prayers that stitched flesh to wire. He sought the point where the choir's song had been locked, where the warp had reached in with a finger and stopped music in its throat. The vision came as he tuned, wolves running through fields of ash beneath bleeding constellations. They were not merely prophecy, they were memory, and the memory tasted of rout. Armies broken in the dark, banners fallen into the mud, the very bone of loyalty snapped and rusted. He saw the rout, not the rout of a single battlefield, but a vast whispering ruin that pulsed through the warp like a sleeping god's dream. The rout was an echo, a trauma folded into the currents of the immaterium, the Horus heresy, not as a history lesson but as a stain that had soaked the warp and bled into everything that drifted near. It was older than the ship, older than the moon, a hunger that remembered betrayal and taught others how to betray. Ulric felt the chill of recognition. This was not ordinary demonic corruption. It was a warp echo, the pattern of treachery finding purchase, learning the cadence of loyalty and turning it inside out. Where Horus had once broken the galaxy, now its afterimage moved through voice and metal, making instruments of memory into instruments of undoing. He called it to himself then, not with a shout but with the soft, steady intonation of a hymn used as a scalpel. Namari et ruina, he breathed, and the words rolled through him like a tide. He forced the choir's locked note into a mirror frequency, folding it out of itself, coaxing meaning back into the houses of sound. For a moment the chamber trembled. Some of the choir's faces relaxed, lids fluttering as a breath returned to lungs. Others remained fixed as statues, mouths still a perfect gentle arc of silent terror. Ulric's hands grew cold. He understood they had been assaulted from within. The warp had not simply shouted. It had recited the memory of betrayal, and the choir had echoed it back. The sound had become a scaffold, and something had been laid on that scaffold to grow. Around him, the runes on his staff dimmed and then flared as if in alarm. Some deep, unseen mechanism within the ship answered the ritual with a thin note that crawled along his spine. He pulled his staff close and closed both eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids, he saw the wolves again, running through ash, the constellations above them weeping red. They were running toward something that smelled of iron and old promises. A whisper breathed into the chamber then, a voice like cloth being torn. It did not come through the choir or the speakers. It was in the fold of the air, in the static that lived between sigils. Ulric Thane, it said, naming him in a tone that was not accusatory but intimate. The priest's jaw tightened. Names carried ballast and names in the warp carried anchors. He rose slowly, listening. The ship around him was quieter now, the deck plates humming with the residual of combat. He moved toward the lumen panel that guarded the corridor, a long strip of polished obsidian meant to reflect light and check sight. He expected only his own reflection, a rune priest gaunt and grave, marked by duty and studied in restraint. Instead, his reflection smiled. It was not his smile, the lips upturned with the confidence of someone else's teeth. The eyes were not his glacier ice, but dark and quick, a spark of brutal humor. A face that belonged to a stranger visited his features. A face older with the cunning of betrayal, a face that smelled of rout. For an instant it shimmered, superimposed like a ghost beneath his own skin. Ulric recoiled as if struck. The glass showed his hands trembling. He pressed a palm to the panel until the cold burned the web of his fingers. The reflected grin remained, impossibly patient, and then, as if a curtain had been pulled, the surface of the lumen cleared again and showed only Ulric's lined face. hollow and startled, cheeks hollowed by the sight. He could still feel that other smile like a coin at the base of his tongue. He tasted treachery, metallic and old, and the image of ruined banners and fallen brothers folded into him until he was a map of ancient wounds. There are ghosts that do not rest because they are not dead. They are patterns. They repeat until someone remembers differently. Ulric felt the echo take shape, and in that reflection he saw the map of a war that had not yet finished. The silence of a dead moon is a thing that holds its breath. You step into it and it measures you in moments. Each moment is a small animal, and the moon remembers how to hunt. They made for the refuge of the mining complex because that is where shelter is promised and hope grudgingly kept. The complex crouched against the wind, stacked halls of corrugated ceramite, steam towers coughing like old lungs, gantries where cranes once swung with the rhythm of industry. Snow and grit scoured its faces. Light came in sick patches through riven skylights, a weak, cold radiance. The storm had not ceased. It had only sharpened its teeth. Ulric's pack moved like a single organism through the ruined corridors. Their breaths came hard and damp in Excalibur masks. They were hunters now, with a hunted's patience. Each step was a study in carefulness. Joran's absence burned like a missing drumbeat in their pace. The space where he'd laughed remained a thin ache. They found the miners in the processing bay. It was a tableau so precise it looked staged by an artisan of cruelty. Bodies lay in circles, boots to center, heads out, faces up, hands splayed toward the rim. Their uniforms, torn and stained with old grease, were turned outward to show the seams. Around each ring, someone had painted angular glyphs in dried blood, jagged lines intersecting like teeth. The glyphs ran in patterns a Rune Priest could read at a glance and call a name to. The 8-pointed star carved in looping scars. It was not a miner's superstition. It was Khorne's grammar written in flesh. Signa bent and checked a throat. The man's eyes were fixed wide in a last bright wonder. There was no sign of struggle, no blast marks, no bullet holes. The blood had been poured with a patience that suggested ritual, not slaughter. Yet the air thrummed like the inside of a drum. Heart drums, Brack whispered. He put his ear near the floor. At first it seemed absurd. Metal groans, wind, the distant whistle of failed machinery. Then he heard it. A low, steady thump from the shafts below, a cadence like a great beast, sleeping but breathing in measured pain. Bolt shells thumped like heartbeats now whenever a trooper fired. Each trigger felt like a blow to that shared drum in the mine's ribs. The environment answered every sound, amplifying it, shaping it into pattern and purpose. The deeper they went, the louder the subterranean percussion became. Pacing accelerated as the drum quickened, each 20-second slice of action gaining momentum like a huntsman closing on scent. They rounded the refinery furnace and saw the first of them, Chaos Marines in the blood red of Khorne. They were statues, and then they moved. Massive forms plated in war-painted ceramite, helmets nailed with spikes, icons of the 8-pointed stars screaming from their pauldrons. Their weapons were crude, heavy, bolters scarred with ritual runes, blades the color of dried iron. Where this warband had passed, metal shone with the polish of trophies. Joints whispered with oil and blood. The nearest Marine tipped ahead, lens glow sweeping the body of the room like a searchlight. He saw the Grey Hunters. He smiled through the helm as if he liked the sight. His mouth made the shape of a ritual, either of victory or mockery. Then he spoke in a voice like a grinder. Blood for the All-Father. He bellowed, and the words hung in the air like a sacrilege. It was a mocking parody of the Space Wolves' cry. Their speech had been ground through the mesh of Khorne's liturgy and spat back as taunt. Bolter fire answered. Short, brutal. The first shots carved arcs across the refinery's empty vats, sending showers of steam and slag. Ulric dove, axe swinging, steel glancing off warped plate. The combat was immediate and savage. Sentences shortened to staccato, fire, impact, grunt, singe, crack. The air filled with spent casings and the scent of burnt iron. Rurik's last burst slammed into a Marine's gauntlet and he staggered back as if struck by an avalanche. Signa danced between pillars, blade flashing, catching a servo flesh seam and spilling a mechanical scream into the cavern. Brack took a round in the shoulder and kept going, teeth bared, driving a charging strike that split a Marine's greave into molten ribbons. The Chaos Marines did not fight with careful formations. They were weight and momentum and ritual. One raised a chain axe, and the sound of it kissing the air was like a bell tolling doom. Each impact rang the mind like a peal. Ulric met that chain axe with his own axe, a clash that sent sparks like embers into the breathing dark. He could feel the hammer of the world in each block. Every 20 seconds, the drums in the shafts answered with a fresh tempo. The miners' bodies seemed to sing in resonance, every gunshot stitched into the mine's slow, inexorable song. The Grey Hunters' training kept them alive. Cover, volley, close. And yet the enemy's ferocity and size made each movement cost in flesh. At one point, the room changed shape. A vent collapsed, sending a cascade of gravel and the pressurized hiss of a burst pipe. The falling stone pinned Rurik's ankle. The world narrowed to a pin-warm circle. Ulric saw him, lunged, and hauled with a strength that tore at tendon. He tore Rurik free with a grunt, and in the process took a glancing blow to the ribs. An impact like a hammer that stole his breath. Pain flared. The old Fenrisian hunger rose in his belly. He ignored it. Joran's absence echoed louder than any shout. Ulric could see his ghost in the peripheral light. The missing space that had once been filled with a laugh, an elbow thrown in ease. A space that now called like an empty cuff. The battle swelled and then narrowed. The Chaos Marines, despite their bloodlust, were not mindless. They fought as if rehearsed, as if part of a greater cadence that pulsed from below. One lifted his gauntlet, and in its palm burned a sigil, fresh, hot, carved with ritual fire. He pressed the tip of the sigil carver to the forearm of a fallen miner, and it glazed as if branding a covenant. Eric's throat burned with smoke and the sang of ozone. He stood tall against a charging Marine, axe raised. The chain axe found his side. For a terrible second he thought armor would hold. It did, partially. The blade sliced through mail and jerkin, found a gap at the flank. A hot spear of pain drove upward. He felt metal bite flesh, felt the world spill in a tight, hot line across his insides. He staggered back, hands finding a grate for balance. The Grey Hunters closed around him, throwing themselves between him and the Red God's minion. He collapsed to a knee, adrenaline roaring. Pain sang down his limbs in white notes. Blood warmed the inside of his mail, slick and alien. For a breath, he could see the ceiling of the mine as a dark cavern, each pipe a rib. The drum beneath them beat like a war horn, yet he did not fall completely. He smelled hot iron and heard Cena's voice close and steady. "Hold, Lord." He pressed the edge of his boot into the grate and forced breath into his lungs. He tasted the burn of blood and grit. Then with a savage animal motion, he rose again, grabbing a fallen shard of metal and driving it toward the approaching Marine. The enemy took a step back, and then, as if obeying a plan, the Chaos Marines halted their advance. They made a collective sound of triumph, and then slunk away, not as retreat but as selection, choosing to leave the wounded as a message. One of them stepped close to Ulric as he knelt, and with a slow, ceremonial movement, pressed a burning sigil into the left pauldron of his armor. The heat seared through metal and flesh alike. It left a brand that smoked like a curse. "Remember this," the Marine rasped, voice like grinding gears, and he spat a sputter of ichor. "We mark our hunt." They withdrew into the steaming corridors with the same deliberate rhythm as their arrival. The drum slowed and then faded into the levels below. Above, the storm's howl took up the empty places where their footsteps had been. Ulric's breath came ragged. He tasted salt and iron. He was impaled, wounded deep enough that the world had shifted. But he was still alive. The sigil burned into his armor, smoked black and red where the brand ate into the ceramite, leaving a pattern that glowed faintly like the trace of a star map. When the dead moon awakens, it writes in scars. Remember the sound of the drum. Remember who marked you. For tomorrow the hunt resumes and the moon keeps its ledger. Close your eyes, brother. Not to sleep, not yet. Close them to the world you think you know and listen to the silence between the stars. There is a music there, older than banners and older than oaths, and it will rearrange the bones of anyone who hears it for too long. The Fenrisian Vow shuddered in a human sleep as the crew did what soldiers do when the world tilts. They gathered what steadiness they could and clung to it. Ulric Thane returned to his shrine under a sky of metal, the Geller field chamber, where carved runes kept the warp from leaning too close to the ship's bones. He moved with the cautious ceremony of a man walking through a minefield, each lowered foot a prayer, each griffed hand an invocation. The shrine itself was a compact cathedral of engineering and faith, concentric bands of woven circuitry and iron-laced prayer cloths, a halo of relay runes that shimmered faintly when the ship's hull sighed under strain. Candles would have been an affectation here. The light was rune glow in the field's breath. Ulric arranged his instruments, a coil of blessed wire, a heart rod of carved iron, a small bowl of distilled seawater from Fenris, its surface reflecting the faint lights like a captive sky. He began the rite the way his masters had taught. Slow, precise, syllables falling like stones into a well. The incantation was not a shout but a shaping. He wove the Geller's threads through the ship's own power lines, aligning their hum to the tune he wanted rather than the tune the warp insisted on. Outside, the hull moaned and the ship's bones flexed as if from an old bruise. The shrine held, and for a time there was a small, ordered peace. Then the song brushed his ear. It entered not in a moment, but like a tide, a pressure lifting from the far side of the field and threading itself through the runes. At first, Ulric thought it was the choir, a ghost from the chamber he had tended. But the tone was different, older, colder, with the rhythm of wind across a frozen blade. It slithered through the Geller's weave and sought the spaces where the ship's prayers lay thin. Ulric's hands paused. The syllables of his litany hung in the air. The song wrapped around the edges of the chamber's light. And for the first time since he'd been aboard, he felt the Geller's hum sharpen, like a blade that had been honed on a stone. He listened. What he heard was not the warp's usual screaming chorus, but a lullaby redrawn in the hand of grief. The melody at its center was familiar to every Fenrisian heart, a child's refrain parents had hummed across generations as wolves slept by the fire. Ulric remembered the cadence, soft syllables for the young, a promise of teeth and protection at night. It should have been comfort. Instead, the notes had been stretched until they curved like claws. The lullaby had become wrong. Each phrase was tuned slightly off-key, like a blade bought a little too sharp. Harmonics skewed, the intervals given a smear of noise. Under the melody there was a sub-harmony, a second voice, woven from static and old orders. Where the lullaby promised shelter, the hidden line promised hunger. Where it once said, "Sleep, little wolf," the warp song now sang, "Sleep, little wolf, and do not wake." Ulric felt the hair at the back of his neck rise. He adjusted the runes, coaxing a purer pitch into the weave, trying to outsing the wrongness. He sang the counterphrase beneath his breath, a small bone chant his grandmother had taught him. A series of harmonic locks designed to trap a stray echo and fold it back on itself. The Geller's filaments shivered in response, and a ripple spread through the chamber like a thin, terrified laugh. It did not end the song. It only made the other voice aware of him. Images came then, sudden and lucid, like flashes through a ruined mirror. Wolves with pelts stained not by ash, but by the sheen of something unnameable, running across a plain that was not of any earth Ulric had ever seen. Above them, constellations bled slow and quiet, filaments of light like torn banners. In the distance, a figure stood under those bleeding stars, hooded, hands raised to the heavens, and behind that figure a ring of men and machines and whispers. The image was a ritual, not merely a beacon but a lure, a line thrown into the dark to catch hunger. Ulric's throat tightened. The voice in the song hinted at architecture, not random noise. It suggested design, patterns he had seen once in forbidden charts and worse, the sigillic geometry of a warband's ritual. He reached outward through the Geller with his mind, threads of thought like probes seeking purchase in the wave. There, tangled within the beacon's harmonics in his mind, was a name stripped down by cadence and hunger, the Crimson Coil. The phrase came to him not as fact, but as sense, an identity locked into the warp's pattern. He had heard of warbands that did not bear banners but templates, cults who stitched machine to demon, who fed on solemnity and converted it into force. The Crimson Coil, a strand of corruption that forged engines from blood and memory, had been a whisper on the lips of old veterans and a rumor hummed by tribunal scrolls. He had not expected to find them here. He had not expected their name to be threaded into a child's lullaby. Ulric's hands trembled. The shrine's runes flickered under the strain of his will. He pulled the vision in close, like a man drawing an animal to the hearth, and there it was, a beacon, the Skelheim lattice, tuned not to signal rescue but to signal appetite. Its harmonics were a coax, a tuning fork, tuned to the pattern the Crimson Coil used to call their kin across the void. The more the ship answered in fear or anger, the louder the lure sang. He realized with a clean, cold accuracy that made his teeth ache. The beacon had not sought help from allies. It had learned to sing the names its hunters loved most. It had learned how to string a wolf's memory into sound and use that sound as bait. It did not merely call for aid, it called for the hunter. Ulric forced his lips around a prayer lip and sang the counterpoint loud enough to unspool the song's weave. The rite should have damped the lure, cut its harmonics, left it as a dead thing. For a moment, as the runes pulsed bright and the chamber hummed with forced order, he thought perhaps it had. Then his vision broke in a way that made him catch his breath. A shadow moved inside the song, a second voice layered exactly with his own. His words returned to him amplified and folded, as if the warp had taken his counsel and re-sang it back through a stranger's throat. He felt the hair on his arms stand straight. The Geller's filaments shuddered like strings under a hand. Ulric's eyes rolled back as if listening with every cell. He tried to anchor himself with the iron discipline of his order, but the double tone corroded certainty. Two voices sounded inside his skull now, his own shaping the ritual and the other answering with the same cadence, the same breath, but with a timbre that was not his. It spoke in a layered consonant, and then, with a voice like two men breathing from a single throat, it said, "They come howling." His knees went weak. The shrine's runes pulsed cold and bright. For a slip of a second, Ulric felt the ship itself pay attention. A living thing, lifting its face toward a storm it had been promised in dreams. When the warp learns a lullaby, brother, it does not intend to soothe. It intends to teach the wolves a new song, and to make them answer. Listen close, for the next verse is hungry. Every hunter has a song. Some sing it in glory, others hum it in hunger, and some weld it in iron and bleed it into the stars. The void shivered as they came through, a flotilla of derelict vessels stitched together by sin and memory. Hulks of once proud strikecraft, their hulls rusted to the color of dried blood, their engines limping on stolen fire. Cables hung like entrails between them, sharing energy and decay in equal measure. The fleet of the Crimson Coil drifted through the black above Skelheim 9, their silhouettes barely visible against the glare of a dying sun. Inside the flagship anvil of sorrow, the forges glowed a dull, arterial red. Steam and smoke breathed through the ribbed corridors, giving the ship the illusion of lungs. At its heart, amid a cathedral of machinery and chained servitors, stood warpsmith Karvan, master of the coil, once iron warrior, now apostate of every creed but his own. Karvan's voice was a furnace. "Bring it up." Two tech thralls obeyed. Chains screamed as they hoisted a broken dreadnought chassis from the pit. Sparks fell like snow. The half-thing twitched, its sarcophagus split, wires moving like tendrils. Its occupant, or what was left of him, crooned softly, a voice encoded in pain. "Soon," Kar murmured, stepping close enough that the machine's heat slicked his scarred flesh. His face was half hidden beneath a skull mask of black iron, but his one organic eye burned bright molten gold. "You will be reborn, brother. Not as a slave of Mars, not as a cog in the Emperor's corpse machine. You will be mine. You will be his." He placed a hand on the machine's hull, whispering in the language of sparks and circuitry, a prayer to the demons living in the wires. The dreadnought shivered, as if it could hear. Around them, Servitors worked in near silence, their lips sewn shut, their hands fused into tools. On every surface, the 8-pointed star was scored deep, the lines filled with cooled blood that gleamed like glass. "Lord Varn," came a voice over the vox, tremulous and eager. "Long-range Auspex confirms the Fenrisian vessel in orbit. They've taken the bait." Carr turned, amusement curling like smoke behind his mask. "The wolves always come for the wounded. It is their blessing and their cage." He stepped toward the bridge, motion smooth and deliberate, cloak trailing sparks. The door irised open to reveal a chamber half-observation deck, half-wound. The glass was cracked in spiderwebs, the void beyond bleeding light through the fissures. He stood there, arms crossed, staring at the dead moon below. Below him, Skelheim 9 rotated like a coin of ash, its mining stations half buried under storms. A few vox flares marked the Space Wolves' positions, bright, defiant beacons in the darkness. Carr admired that. "Fenrisian sons," he said softly, almost fondly. "They fight with the arrogance of gods. They do not yet understand they are prayers in the making." Behind him came another figure, taller, robed in black and brass, her limbs wrapped in cabling that glistened with oil. Magos Lyria, mistress of the coil's bioforges. Her voice was a fluttering whisper, her throat more vox grill than flesh. "They bring with them the bloodline you seek," she rasped. "The Wolfkin?" Carr nodded. "Their lord is among them, Eirik Stormfang, a name heavy with legacy. His gene seed sings with the same savagery as Russ himself." He turned, his steps heavy on the iron deck. "You know what that means, Lyria?" The Magos inclined her head, her voice glitching with static joy. "A demon engine born from Astartes' purity, a beast of loyalty and fury chained to chaos. A rout engine." Carr smiled, though it was a thing without kindness. "A weapon worthy of the coil." They called themselves the Crimson Coil because that is how they saw the galaxy, a vast, slow spiral of blood and metal turning forever inward. Theirs was not the chaos of madness or lust or plague. Theirs was the worship of transformation, the belief that the flesh of gods and the machinery of men could be forged into something eternal. Each ship in their fleet carried its own choir of pain, chanting prisoners wired into its reactors, their screams translated into energy. Every engine turned on faith and nerve. To those who heard them through the void, the fleet did not sound like ships at all. It sounded like a hymn. Carr Varn moved between the choir pits, his boots ringing against the grating. Below, the coil slaves swayed in their chains, their faces pale masks of ecstasy and torment. Their bodies had been grafted into the ship's interior, ribs replaced with piping, veins replaced with wiring. Their every heartbeat powered the fleet. Carr raised a clawed hand, and the chanting deepened, becoming a rolling wave of vowels. It was beautiful in its horror. He stood at the center, head tilted back, eyes closed. For a moment, the sound drowned everything else. This was his faith. The Iron Warriors had worshipped discipline and precision, the cold calculus of siegecraft. But Carr Varn had learned a greater truth in the warp. Order is not the opposite of chaos. Order is its instrument. Every cog turns, every scream resonates, every soul fills a role. The machine is the god. The bridge's lighting flickered. For a heartbeat, Carr saw his reflection multiplied across the fractured glass. A dozen versions of himself, each one whispering a different prayer. Then the Vox sparked to life again. Lord Varn, target lock confirmed on the Fenrisian vessel. They hold orbit above the lattice and scanning surface anomalies. "Good," Carr murmured. "Let them dig, let them bleed. When they have spent their courage, we will harvest what remains." He looked to Magos Lyria. "Prepare the harvest casket. I want its conduits pure, its matrix untainted." She hesitated. "You mean to bind a living Astartes?" "Not just living," Carr said, voice low, almost gentle. "I mean to bind a soul that still believes it can defy the warp. Only such arrogance can forge a true demon engine. The flesh must resist before it yields." He turned back toward the glass. "A space wolf's rage is a forge hotter than any I have known. We will catch that flame and shape it into eternity." There is a moment before the predator strikes when the world holds still. when every sound in creation seems to bend toward the hunter's breath. The coil lived for that moment. Karvan descended to the main deck. There, his warriors assembled, Chaos Marines in armor scarred by centuries, each plate carved with the runes of the forge. They stood motionless, crimson under the forge's light. Some still bore the heraldry of the Iron Warriors, though now defaced and burned. Others wore the sigils of the coil, a spiral of molten copper twisting endlessly inward. Kar's voice cut through the forge's roar. "Brothers, the wolves have come to Skelheim. They think to cleanse it. They think their purity will outlast the warp's patience." A low chuckle rolled through the ranks, deep and metallic. Kar continued, "We will show them what patience truly means. Tonight we take their song and weld it to our own. Tonight we craft a god." Magos Lyria lifted her staff, the servo skulls around her chittering prayers. The engines responded, a rumble that spread through the hull like an awakening giant. One by one, the ships of the coil turned their battered prows toward the moon. From the void, their fleet looked like a rusted wound spreading through the stars. Blood glittered across the hulls like constellations. The void glass caught the light of distant suns and reflected it as 1,000 tiny fires, each one a soul devoured, each one a name forgotten. Vox officer, fearful, reverent. "My lord, the Fenrisian cruiser has powered its shields. Should we engage?" Karvan smiled beneath his mask. "Not yet. Let them see us. Let them remember what hunts them." He extended a single mechanical claw, the sigils along his arm igniting like molten veins. "Decloak the fleet." And so the dead moon gained new stars, red, jagged, and alive. Above Skelheim 9, the crimson coil unfurled its wings of rust and fire. The void itself seemed to pulse with the beat of their forges. And beneath that sound, beneath the drums and the chanting, another voice whispered through the warp. "We come howling." When stars bleed, the watched world becomes a battlefield. Watch closely, brother, for metal and blood learn the same geometry, and every strike draws a new constellation. The Fenrisian Vow answered their summons like a hound, leaping to a long whistle. Shields flared to life in a halo of blue. Void lances spat and arced into the dark. Against the hiss and thunder of the crimson coil, the cruiser's batteries screamed like a thing tearing itself awake. Explosions rippled along the black like meteor showers, each flare painting the hulls in cold, brutal light. "Brace for boarding," Eric barked, voice ablade through the vox. Behind him, the hangar bay burned with frenetic energy as crews prepared evac and counterboarding measures. Thrusters shuddered as fighters launched through the lattice of wrecks and ruin. The space above Skelheim was a scatter of fire and wreckage, a storm of steel and prayer. Fast rhythm, quick sentences, bolter fire, sparks. A craft broke like a shell. Men shouted. The hull groaned. Boarding clamps latched. A chaos grapnel hooked their aft bulkhead with the grace of a predator. Ropes snaked over the rail. Figures poured through the breach like black water. The hangar door, a slab of tortured metal, trembled under impact and then gave. For a breath, the world was nothing but smoke and grapnel and the smell of burning servitor foam. Ulric moved through the chaos like a blade in the dark. He gathered survivors, tech crew, gun servitors, wounded grey hunters, shepherding them toward the launch bays. Around him, the deck erupted into close war. Bolter strobes, the scream of power axes, the sick ring of chainswords. The Space Wolves fought with feral precision. Their defense was a serrated braid of practiced movement, slow now, sensory aftermath. Vacuum swallowed the screams that breached the hull. The lights dipped and flared. Instruments throbbed. A whirl of warm copper and acrid smoke licked the deck as ruptured conduits bled their last prayers. The ship's bones creaked, a great animal in pain, and the smell of ozone and char rose into the throat like ghosts. Close combat, axe met chainsword in a shower of burning prayers. A chaos champion vaulted into the bay, red armor bristling with talismans. He struck like a falling shard of mountain. Ulric met him in the open, axe roaring, the banner at his shoulder snatching the dim light. Their weapons collided in a ring of sparks, metal bit metal. Prayers and curses tangled in the air like torn flags. Die for your false throne. The champion spat, a taunt sharpened in 1,000 forges. Eric answered with a howl that was not wholly human. He swung and his axe found a seam. The champion's pauldrons cracked, and a geyser of ichor spat across the grating. The enemy staggered, then surged with animal spite, blade whistling. Eirik planted his feet and drove the haft home. Steel-kissed chest. The champion's scream was a bell struck at the wrong end. He slumped, and Eric stood over him with blood on his gauntlets. But death is not always simple in the warp's shadow. From the fallen champion's shattered armor crawled a dim, luminous thread, a vein of warp energy that shivered like trapped aurora. It pooled around the wound like oil on cold water. The light bent and shimmered, and from it coalesced a shape that was both smaller and monstrously wrong. A thing stitched from the champion's wrath and the lattice's hunger. It flexed a limb that had never been born and howled a sound that set teeth on edge. Eric's throat closed. The creature reared like a child mocked into life, then lunged with a speed that mocked size. Its skin was the sheen of old varnish. Its eyes were coal flecks fed with malice. In an instant, it vanished into the smoke and the storm of fighting, a new note in the chorus of death. Around him the borders pressed. The Fenrisian Vow's crew moved to salvage and fight. The space wolves pushed them back, blade and bullet and raw will. Breach teams fell in red arcs. The hangar's lights stuttered. For a moment the bay was an abstract of shadow and sparks, a painting of slaughter. Eric realized then that brute force alone would not end this night. The Coil had not merely sent troops, they had sent ritual, an infection that learned and birthed. Each slain foe could seed something new. Each pitched defense fed their designs. Quick line rhythm returns. Fall back. Eric roared. Get to the launch pontoons, go, go. The evac boats screamed open. Men and women dove into escape tubes as harnesses collapsed and lines snapped. Eirik's own pack fought as a wedge. Cena flanked. Rurik shoved a technician into a bay hatch. Brack covered the rear with a lasburst that seared a crimson arc into a charger's helm. Haldar took a wound and kept moving. They made for the skiffs. Ulric's shout echoed over the ship's comms then, a voice raw with dread. It snapped the crew like a whip. The warp is within the hull. He screamed from the bridge. The words hung for an instant like a curse dissolving into static. Men froze. 100 tiny human acts suspended in a single breath. A hand on a rail, a boot half raised, a child's lullaby trapped in the throat. Then the world split again and they moved. Boards burned. Engines coughed. The launch clamps thundered as skiffs drove free, cutting a path through debris and the last flares of battle. The Fenrisian Vow pitched like a wounded beast, its bow cleaving a wake of ionized gas. Fragments of the Crimson Coil's hull drifted like dying comets in their wake. Slowly now. Aftermath's taste. Out in the dark, the stars watched cold. The skiffs arced away, carrying men wrapped in smoke and grief. The void closed over the scene like a hand. A single bolt of crimson light traced back to the hangar, and for a breath, a figure could be seen on the deck. A silhouette framed in fire and shadow. The new thing birthed from the champion's corpse, hunched and grotesque. Tasting the air, Eric cradled his side, blood hot on his palm. He watched his banner ripple in the docking bay's draft and thought of Joran, of the miners' runes, of the priests fused to machines. He tasted iron and cold and the deep, bitter tang of a trial that had not ended. The launches roared. The Fenrisian Vow screamed once, a great animal tearing a last breath, and then settled into a trance of burning and prayer as the bridge braced itself for what was already inside. Ulric's voice repeated on the static-laced comm. Thinner now, closer to breaking. The warp, he said, voice gone small. The warp is within the hull. When the warp walks a ship's decks, every door becomes a mouth. There is no simple victory against a thing that learns by eating you. Hold fast, brother. The night is far from over. Every war has its mirror. Every warrior his reflection. And when both are too proud to turn away, the universe holds its breath to see which one will break first. The bridge of the Fenrisian Vow was a ruin of light and flame. The great hololiths had shattered into rivers of static, their ghosts still painting broken constellations across the steel. Glass drifted in zero gravity like frozen tears. Every flicker of the void beyond spilled through the cracked viewport, washing the room in pulses of cold red and pale blue. At the center of that dying cathedral, two figures faced each other. Ulric Stormfang, his armor gouged and blackened, his wolf-pelt cape in tatters. His breath came heavy through broken vox grill, each exhale misting in the cold air. Blood slicked his axe. Carvarn, the warpsmith of the Crimson Coil, towering, monstrous, a skeleton of metal wrapped in the memory of flesh. Cables writhed from his back like serpents tasting the electric air. His voice purred through his vox mask, layered and inhuman. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. The ship's dying heartbeat was their metronome. Sparks fell between them like snow. Carr, calm, mocking. You fight to serve a corpse. Ulric, low, steady. I fight to keep his sons alive. Carr, smiling beneath his mask. And what has it given you, this loyalty? A graveyard of stars and a god who never answers. Ulric, better silence than your gospel of rot. Their weapons met, a thunderclap of steel and will. Axe met claw. Sparks sprayed. The deck plate screamed. They broke apart, circled, clashed again. Each strike was a sentence. Each breath, a curse. Carr lunged. His servo arms lashed forward, gouging sparks from the bulkhead. Ulric rolled beneath the strike, came up swinging. Axe kissed metal. The warpsmith snarled, half laugh, half fury. Carr, you bleed for nothing. You could have been eternal. Ulric, eternity without honor is a prison. Carr's power claw slashed low. Ulric caught the blow on his vambrace. Metal screamed and split. The impact hurled him backward. He struck a console, shattering the screens. Behind him, the void bled through a widening fracture in the glass. The air howled through it, dragging smoke and flame toward the stars. Carr advanced, unhurried. Each step a sermon. Carr, I once believed as you do, in duty, in order, but the Imperium is a rotting god machine that feeds on its children. I chose freedom. Ulric pushed himself upright, eyes pale with fury. Ulric, you chose madness and called it liberty. Sound, a slow rise of music, drums syncing with each clash. They met again. Harder now. Ulric's axe struck shoulder. Carr's claw hammered back, carving a line through armor and flesh. They locked face to face, helmets almost touching. Carr, I fight to become a god. Ulric, and yet both of us drown in the same blood. For a breath, silence, save the whisper of vacuum beyond the glass. Then the fight broke open again. Axe, claw, chain, steel. Each strike shorter, faster, more desperate. One-line combat, one line. Dialogue rhythm sharpens. Ulric, you built this hell. Carr, I perfected it. Ulric, your gods eat their children. Carr, so does yours. Ulric's axe caught Carr's arm, severing a servo limb in a burst of sparks. Carr staggered, roaring in digital fury, and drove forward with his claw. The talons punched through Ulric's pauldron, driving him to one knee. Ulric gasped, the smell of burnt ceramite thick in the air. Carr leaned close, voice a whisper inside the storm. Carr, you see, Wolflord, all your honor ends the same way, at the edge of a machine built by better men. Ulric's teeth bared, blood bright against his lips. Ulric, better men don't build cages. He twisted, wrenching his body sideways, the motion pulling Carr off balance. The claw tore free. Ulric surged upward, axe flashing like lightning. Strike, impact. The blade buried deep in the warpsmith's chest, splitting his armor and the cables beneath. Carr froze. The lights inside his mask flickered, blue, then crimson. Ulric held the haft with both hands, twisting it like a key. Ulric, snarling, your forge is cold. Smith. Carr choked out something that might have been laughter. Carr, you think this ends me? Ulric, it ends someone. He kicked the warpsmith backward. Carr staggered, falling against the fractured glass. The viewport cracked further under his weight. The void peered in, patient, waiting. For a moment, Carvarn stood impaled against his own power claw, cables writhing like dying snakes. He reached up, blood streaming through his armor's seams. and pressed a sigil into the wound. Carr, voice breaking, triumphant. Even in death, the forge remembers its maker. Sound, a low vibration, like a ship's engine turning inside out. Ulric felt it before he understood it, the deep, stomach-sick pull of the warp. Blooming behind his eyes, the lights on the bridge flared red, then ultraviolet. The air thickened, as if made of syrup and whispers. Carr's body convulsed. The wound in his chest became a mouth. The metal around it folded inward, teeth of steel grinding. The bridge's walls warped, twisting into a spiral. Ulric staggered, gripping the rail. He looked up and saw it through the broken glass. Above Skelheim 9, the stars were no longer still. A circle of crimson light had opened in the void. Not light, but the absence of it. A wound, pulsing, rimmed with gold fire. It spread like an infection, swallowing starlight. Fragments of the Crimson Coil's fleet were drawn into its gravity, their hulls stretching like wax in a furnace. The void screamed with them. Carr's body disintegrated into dust and wire, his laughter echoing through the ship's vox, a sound both human and machine. "Forge, eternal," he whispered, and let the blood fall. Then he was gone. Ulric stood amid the ruin, armor scorched, blood running down his face. He looked out the shattered viewport and saw the sky breaking open. From the edges of the rift, something fell. Not light, not ships, but burning fragments of the warp itself. They rained down across the planet below, streaking crimson trails across the void. Blood on the stars. Every victory has its price, every death its echo. Above the dead moon, the crimson rain began to fall, meteors of faith and fury, each one a promise broken in the making. Ulric watched, his breath shallow, his eyes reflecting the fire. The rift pulsed once more, casting his silhouette across the dying bridge. Somewhere deep in the ship, alarms screamed. But louder still was Ulric's voice through the vox, sharp, frantic, echoing from the bridge above. Ulric, distant, terrified. "The warp is open. The sky is bleeding." Ulric stared at the rift, whispering to himself, to gods, to ghosts, to whatever still listened. Ulric, low. "Then let it bleed." The deck trembled. The stars vanished behind a tide of red light. In the void, where blood becomes prayer and prayer becomes war, there are no heroes, only those who howl the longest. And on that night, the stars learned to howl back. Every saga ends with silence, but silence is never empty. Sometimes, if you listen close enough, you can still hear what it tried to swallow. The Fenrisian Vow was coming apart. Its spine had split under the warp's hunger. Fire bled from its decks. Geller wards flickered and died one by one. Like candles in a hurricane, the ship's voice, the Vox AI, the machine spirit, screamed once, then went quiet. Inside the hangar, what few space wolves remained dragged the wounded toward drop pods. Armor cracked, eyes hollow, they moved without words. Duty had burned all language from them. Ulric Stormfang stood last among them, helm off, face streaked with soot and blood. He looked once toward the shattered bridge above, where the warp rift bled through the void, and then to the rune-scarred pods below. "Go," he rasped. "Fenris still calls. Go." A few hesitated, wanting to argue, but one look at his eyes silenced them. The drop pods fired one by one, thunderclaps in the vacuum. Silver streaks fell from the dying cruiser toward the burning world below. Ulric turned back toward the corridor, toward the bridge that still flickered with crimson light. There, among the dying consoles and drifting ash, Ulric Thane slumped over the Vox array. His armor had fused to the floor. Warp burn had eaten through the seals at his throat, leaving black veins glowing faintly beneath the skin. He smiled when Ulric reached him, a cracked, half-remembered expression. "Did you see it?" Ulric whispered. Ulric knelt beside him. "I saw. The coil is gone." Ulric's eyes rolled toward the viewport. Outside, the crimson rift widened, swallowing debris, light, everything. The planet below looked like it was weeping fire. "Gone," Ulric murmured. Nothing that touches the warp is ever gone. He reached toward the Vox controls with a trembling hand. Help me, brother. One last record, for whoever hears. Eric hesitated, then nodded. He pressed the rune, sound, static rising. Then Ulric's voice over comm, softer now, distant, like memory being replayed. Ulric, recording. This is Rune Priest Ulric Thane of the Fenrisian Vow. Final transmission. To any who find this, to any who still listen in the long dark, know this, the howl you hear. It is not ours. It is what remains when the stars bleed. Music, faint howl echoing behind his words, distorted, layered with static. Ulric coughed, blood bright against his lips. The lights dimmed further. The warp's glow crept along the floor like spilled ink. He looked at Eric, eyes now pale white with sight beyond sight. Go, my lord, the storm will not spare you. I will hold what's left. Eric's jaw clenched. No wolf dies alone. Ulric's faint laugh broke into static. Then I'll meet you in the howl, brother. Sound, console crackling. Warp energy surging. The rift flared once, brilliant, almost holy. Eric stood, turned, and walked through the shuddering corridor. His armor sparked with stray warp light, and the air shimmered with half-seen shapes clawing for form. He reached the last pod bay. The hull beneath him buckled, groaned. He sealed himself inside, the pod ejected and spinning. Burning, falling. Behind him, the Fenrisian Vow broke in two and was swallowed whole, the last of its fire dimmed. Then, there was only the rift, pulsing like a wound that refused to close. In the void above Skelheim, nothing moved. The warp tear closed with a sigh, leaving only fragments drifting in orbit. Pieces of a ship, fragments of men, memories turned to dust. Days later, an Imperial listening post on the rim caught a transmission. A broken log, repeating every 12 hours, faint beneath the static. Sound. Faint Vox static. Ulric's recorded voice again, soft as a dying flame. Ulric, recording. The howl you hear. It is not ours. It is what remains when the stars bleed. Pause. The sound fades to nothing. The Mechanicus filed it under unknown anomaly. They sealed it away. But in the years that followed, other ships, merchantmen, patrols, pilgrim fleets, reported hearing something strange along that same frequency. A whisper. A growl. A sound halfway between grief and worship. And so, Shardwalker, another saga ends in silence. The wolves are gone. The forge is quiet. The stars no longer bleed. Or perhaps they simply learned to hide it better. But listen long enough, and you may still hear them, a howl without lungs, a prayer without gods, a story without end. The void remembers everything we try to forget. If you've heard their song, if you've felt that cold breath in the dark, then you too have walked the edge of the warp. You too have become a shard walker. Stay close. There are more stories, more transmissions from the long night between stars. Subscribe to Stay Forged Horrors for more tales whispered from the void. But remember this, listener, if the howl ever answers back, it means they're not gone.